Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of John, Part 3, in our continuing study of the life of Christ. Where we left off last time, the public ministry of Jesus appeared over 3 years, and Jesus was seen all throughout Israel, both in Galilee and Judea and Samaria, and points in between. But now, as we come to chapter 12, we move into that segment dealing with the private ministry of Jesus. This is the final week in the life of Jesus, the Passion Week, and it's going to be exclusively in Jerusalem, although it'll start off just on the other side of the hill from Jerusalem. Chapter 12, verse 1, Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, like I said, we're entering that final week, and he came to Bethany. Bethany's on the east side of the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem, you cross to the Mount of Olives, and from the top of the Mount of Olives, you have a full view of the city of Jerusalem. But he came to Bethany where Lazarus was. This was the same Lazarus who Jesus had raised from the dead in chapter 11. A bit about that, when Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, he'd already been dead for something like 4 days. So bad that when Jesus said, uncover, roll away the stone, uncover the tomb, they said, we really don't want to do that. He stinks by now. But that didn't stop Jesus. He had raised him from the dead. Verse 2, so they made him a supper there, almost like a celebration supper, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. And these characters have already been introduced in the previous chapter. Mary, then, she's the sister of Martha, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume, of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. Now, this is a very subservient, she is humbling herself. But notice what is mentioned, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, when was the last time that we've read about aroma in the Gospel of John? Well, I've just mentioned that back in chapter 11 and verse 39, where Jesus said, move the stone away, where Lazarus is, and they said, well, there'll be a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days. But now, by contrast, instead of a stench, we see a fragrant aroma that fills the house. Somebody pointed out a while back that all throughout the last week of the ministry of Jesus, that wherever you see Jesus going, wherever you see him speaking, and maybe all the way up to the cross, you would maybe smell a sweet aroma. An aroma of who he was, but an aroma that had been placed on him by Mary in this incident. Well, we have next the triumphal entry, where Jesus now leaves Bethany. He crosses, and as in this picture, we're actually standing on the peak of the Mount of Olives, looking toward Jerusalem. You see the Dome of the Rock. That's where the temple was back in the days of Jesus. And Jesus has his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, an entry which Matthew, Mark, Luke, and now John all have recorded. Now, as we come to chapter 13, we have the Last Supper, and it begins as Jesus serves his disciples and he washes their feet. Now, we're used to reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where we see him taking the bread and the wine and breaking the bread. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood. We're not going to read about that in the Gospel of John. He doesn't deny it, but that's not his focus. Instead, he looks at how Jesus serves his disciples by washing their feet. And then he speaks in chapter 14 about his departure. I go to prepare a place for you, he says. And if I go, that means I'm going to come again. But I'm going to leave a comforter with you, a helper. I'm going to leave my spirit with you. In chapter 15, he instructs them about the importance of abiding in him, just like a branch needs to be connected to the vine or else it withers up and dies. Jesus says, you need to be connected to me. That's the pivotal point in this section of Jesus' teaching. He speaks again about his departure in chapter 16. Again, he speaks about the Spirit that's going to be given. And then in chapter 17, as they are leaving the upper room, He again serves his disciples, this time by praying for his disciples. And we see this long intercessory prayer where he prays not for himself, but he prays for the disciples and for their well-being, about how the Lord would take care of them. Next, we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron. The Kidron, it's a brook. It's also a very steep valley. And it separates Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. It's sort of the low point. And Jesus comes here, and there's a garden there where he enters with his disciples. And Judas knew of the place. And Judas brings the soldiers, and they come with the chief priests, the Pharisees, lanterns, torches, weapons, and Judas betrays him. And he is leading the people to arrest Jesus. And Jesus, he doesn't act like somebody being arrested. In fact, instead, he's actually giving instructions. He's giving orders. You say, wait a minute, who's in charge here? And Jesus is speaking like he's in charge. He says, okay, you found me, let these go, speaking of his disciples, and they do. And of course, there's that instance where Peter takes his sword and slashes. It's interesting that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us who did the thing with the sword. In John, we're told that it's Peter. Maybe because the statute of limitations is over. Maybe by this time Peter had already been put to death, so it can't be held against him. But we're told that the servant's name was Malchus, the servant who Peter swings at the servant and cuts off his ear. And Jesus says, hold it right there, and tells him to stop. And he heals Malchus. Can you imagine the servant? By the way, the fact that his name is given makes us wonder if he remained in the service of the high priest. Maybe after this he was released. Maybe after this he became a Christian. I like to think so. Maybe losing an ear caused him to listen to the gospel, pun intended. Next, Jesus is taken before the high priest. This is in verses 12 through 27. And initially, he's taken to Annas. Now you say, wait a second. I thought Caiaphas was the high priest. Well, Annas had been officially the high priest, and it was supposed to be an office for life. But the Romans had intervened and had made him step down and appoint somebody else. So he had appointed first one of his sons, then another of his sons. And he'd run out of sons, so now he has appointed his son-in-law, Caiaphas. And meanwhile, Peter and another disciple, this disciple's not mentioned. It's interesting when John doesn't mention somebody's name. Makes you wonder what's going on here. But Peter and another disciple, this other disciple was known to the house of the high priest and sort of intervened and help Peter to get into the courtyard. And there, of course, we're familiar with the whole denial story about how Peter is asked, aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter says, no, I'm not. And one of the things that John mentions in this, among Peter's denials, is that they are standing, this is chapter 18, verse 18, the slaves and the officers were standing there having made a charcoal fire. Now remember that, because we're going to see that a little bit later in the Gospel of John. A charcoal fire, and that's where they are when Peter denies Jesus. Next, we go from Annas to a hearing before Caiaphas. He's sort of the official high priest right now. Annas, maybe I like to think of him as the real high priest, but he had passed the baton. And so next we go before Caiaphas, and the denial takes place. So you'd had an initial denial, and then 1 and 2 and 3. And next we have the trial before Pilate. This is still at the end of chapter 18. And this is rather extensive, where Pilate says not once, not twice, but 3 different times. Pilate says, I find no guilt in him. And now 3 times, we're going to see a number of things that take place 3 times. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Pilate says 3 times, I find no guilt in him. And then Pilate offers to release someone else he says, look, you can have your choice, either Jesus or Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a scoundrel. He was a criminal, a robber, not just somebody who breaks in and steals, but somebody who does it by force of arms. And he had been arrested and sentenced, and very literally, Barabbas is released and Jesus goes to the cross. I would suggest that it was meant for Barabbas. And there's something symbolic there as well. Now, really was a person named Barabbas, but the name Barabbas is, I think, also significant because Bar is the Aramaic word for son, and Abba, you probably know, is the Aramaic word for father. So son of a father, sort of any man. And Jesus is going to go to the cross. Can I say it this way? For any man, or maybe I should say for every man. And so Pilate brings Jesus out and says, behold your king. You really want to crucify him? And they say, yes, we want to crucify him. And so Jesus is taken to the cross, and he's taken to a place known as Golgotha. Now, we've seen this, both the Latin phrase, when you see it described as Calvary, that's just the Latin, or Golgotha would be the Hebrew. It means the skull place, the place of the skull. And an inscription is set on the cross, and it says, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Of course, Nazarene is speaking of where he's from, but there's sort of a double meaning there, because the term Nazarene also has the idea of a branch. And the Old Testament has a number of prophecies about one whose name will be branch, not necessarily using the same word, but sometimes. And so perhaps we're meant to see more than just the place where he grew up. Next, there's a reference to the soldiers and to the garments, where when someone was crucified, they would actually strip off their clothes. Well, what are they going to do with those old clothes? Well, they separate them among themselves, but they look at the outer tunic, and it's one piece. And rather than tear it, they cast lots for it. They gamble over his garments. And then we have the first of what will be several sayings of Jesus. The first is where he turns to his mother. He's on the cross, and he looks down at her, and he says to her, woman, behold your son. And standing next to her is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then he turns to that disciple and says, behold your mother, as if to say, you take care of her. I won't be able to do that anymore. You act the part of a son to her, and she will act the part of a mother to you. Next, he says, I thirst. Now, that's very short, that's very brief, but it points out the suffering of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus. He really could become thirsty. But remember also, he had already spoken earlier in John that whoever comes to me, I will give them living water. He became thirsty so that we would be spiritually satisfied, so that we could spiritually drink. He suffered thirst so that we never need suffer spiritual thirst. Next, and this is at his death, he cries out, it is finished. In the Greek, this is actually one word. It's a perfect tense. It has been finished, I guess you could best translate it. Tatalicize the term. And it's this idea, complete, finished, done. The work has been completed. And then once he has died, the soldiers come and they want to make sure he's dead. After all, their job is to make sure that living people are dead. And so one of the soldiers takes a spear and thrusts it up underneath his ribs to pierce his very heart. And out comes blood and water. Now, I've read of doctors who have said, there's a reason why this takes place, blood and water, and they give various medical explanations. And I'm sure that's valid, but that's not the reason we are told this in the Gospel of John. The reason that we are told this is because the idea of blood and water are ceremonially significant. That is, you would cleanse with water, but that you would show the death of the innocent substitute with blood. In fact, there were times where a covenant was made, and the people would be sprinkled with blood, but then they would go through a cleansing water ritual, and Jesus encompasses both of those in his very body. He has provided the perfect sacrifice, and he has provided for our cleansing through his own death upon the cross, coming out of his own body. Next, we have the story, this is after the death of Jesus, of two disciples, not the 12, but other disciples, some that had been perhaps a little secretive in their discipleship. We have Joseph of Arimathea, who comes to Pilate and asks permission to take the body and to give it a good Jewish burial. And he takes the body and he has it buried in his own tomb, a brand new tomb that had been cut out of rock. So this is sort of a rich man's tomb. Never before used, and that's significant because oftentimes you take a tomb and you would put not just one person in it, you would put eventually his entire family and his children and grandchildren, and you'd have room for all of those. Well, Joseph had an entirely new tomb cut. No family members had yet been interred therein. And Jesus is going to be placed in this tomb. And not only Joseph, but also Nicodemus, the same one who had come by night in chapter 3, he comes to wrap the body in spices and to care for it. And they're both doing what they think is their very last service for Jesus who has died. Of course, the story doesn't end there. In chapter 20, we come to the resurrection, and it begins with, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. Now, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see that Mary Magdalene plus some other women were there, but they're not mentioned. Only Mary is mentioned. The camera, as it were, is focused on her, and the others are sort of in the background or off the side of the screen. And Mary comes to the tomb and finds that it is empty. And so she runs to tell the disciples. And when she does, Peter and another disciple, was that John? Was that someone else? I don't want to say because I don't know. But Peter and this other disciple, and there's a hint there in that we're told what the other disciple was thinking. So perhaps the one who's writing the story is the other disciple, but maybe not. Peter and the other disciple, they come to the tomb, and the other disciple actually gets there first, and he bends over and he looks in. He's a little cautious. Peter isn't at all. Peter arrives a little bit later, a little bit maybe out of breath, and he just runs right in. And as they go into the tomb, they see it is empty. That the tomb is empty, and the garments are rolled carefully by themselves. And they go on their way, not sure what to make of it, believing the testimony of Mary, but not entirely sure what to make of it. And she's left behind, and she's weeping. And she realizes that somebody has just come on the scene. And first she sees two angels. I'm not sure if she recognized them as such. And they are in the tomb, one by the head, one by the foot. Reminds me a little bit of a place in the Old Testament where we see two angels, one by the head, one by the foot, so to speak. And that is at the Ark of the Covenant. There would be these two cherubim standing over the Ark of the Covenant with their wings outstretched over the Ark. No, now I don't know if there were wings here, but there were these two angels, one by the head, one by the feet, saying, "Why are you weeping? This one's not here," and she's not sure what to make of that. And going outside, she sees one that she takes to be perhaps the gardener, and so she asks, "Where have you taken his body?" She's still assuming somebody has moved the body, even though she's been told. Maybe she heard, maybe it didn't register. And she asks what she thinks is the gardener, and he says to her, "Mary," and she looks up, and it's Jesus. And he has risen from the dead. Well, Mary eventually goes to tell, because Jesus sends her. She wants to sort of hang out with Jesus, and he says, "No, you have to be on your way." And he sends her, and she goes to the upper room and tells the disciples. So later on that evening, they've heard the story of Peter, the empty tomb. They've heard the story of Mary, who said that she saw Jesus alive, but they're not entirely sure what to make of that. They're a little skeptical, and Jesus appears, and he is there before them, and he says, "Receive the Holy Spirit," and he blows on them. Now, you have to recognize that the word for spirit is also the same word for wind, both in Greek and in Hebrew. This works in either language. And he blows on them symbolically, and then he says, receive the Holy Spirit. I don't know if they receive it then or he's speaking prophetically of what's going to happen a few weeks later at on the day of Pentecost. But he says, receive the Holy Spirit. But there's one problem. Thomas isn't there. Thomas is absent. I don't know. I don't know why. Maybe he had some business to take care of. And so when he gets back, they're all saying, "We saw Jesus." And Thomas is saying, "Yeah, right. I don't buy it. I don't believe it. I'm not going to believe it unless I have real evidence. Maybe you just imagined it. Maybe it was a vision. Maybe it was a dream. Unless I touch his hands, put my hands into the nail prints in his hand, put my hand into the spear thrust in his side, I simply will not believe." And sure enough, 8 days later, again, uh, it's almost as though history repeats itself. They're in the upper room, although this time Thomas is there, and Jesus shows up, and he says, "Thomas, I'm here for you. Here, reach here. Look at my hands. Look at my feet. Reach into my side. Touch. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas responds, and I don't think he's taking the Lord's name in vain. I think he's actually addressing the Lord, "My Lord and my God." Thomas has come to believe. And so the chapter closes that there's many other signs that Jesus performed in the presence of the disciples, which aren't written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And that's a great ending, but the book has one more chapter. There has been a faith journey that's been taking place all throughout the Gospel of John. Way back in chapter 1, where Andrew, the first disciple who becomes the first disciple of Jesus, goes to Peter and says, "We found the Messiah." And then Philip, who says, "We found him of whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote," speaking to Nathanael. In chapter 2, we read his disciples believed in him. In chapter 4, we have the Samaritan woman, her testimony, where she goes into the city and sees the men and says, "Come see a man who told me all the things that I've done." This is not the Christ, is it? In chapter 4, verse 42, after the men have come down to meet Jesus for themselves, they say, "For we've heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world." In chapter 4, verse 53, this is the father whose son was sick, and he comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Go home, your son is well." He goes home, and when he finds out that his son is better, he asks, "At what time did he begin to improve?" And when they tell him, the father knew that it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives." And he himself believed, and his whole household. In chapter 6, we have that instance where Jesus has been saying some difficult things, and the crowds have left. And Jesus turns now to the 12. "Do you not want to go away also, do you?" And Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." In chapter 9, we have the instance of the man who was born blind, and Jesus tells him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam at the other end of the city," and he comes back seeing. And when he is questioned by the authorities, they respond by expelling him from the synagogue and the temple. And Jesus, when he'd heard that they'd put him out, finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" After all, he's never been able to see before. And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him." He hasn't seen much yet, but you've seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you. And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Notice how we've moved from just prophet to one who is being worshiped. And yet the story continues, chapter 16, as Jesus is speaking to the disciples. And one of them says, "Now we know that you know all things and have no need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you came from God. In chapter 20, we have the instance where that other disciple, the one that goes with Peter to the empty tomb, the other disciple who had first come to the tomb entered then also after Peter had gone in, and he saw and he believed. And finally, this climactic event with Thomas, where Jesus says to Thomas, reach here your finger and see my hands, and reach here your hand and put it into my side, and be not unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. There's a faith journey where we're watching different people come to faith in Jesus through their circumstances, as they hear Jesus, as they see what he does, as they come to terms with who he is. And we are supposed to be following in their footsteps and coming to faith ourselves. Now we get to the very last chapter. And like I said, chapter 20, you almost get the sense that the book is ended. But we turn the page and there's one more chapter, and we read chapter 21, verse 1. After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. Now, the Sea of Tiberias is another name for the Sea of Galilee. And we're told the story where Simon Peter and some of the other disciples, like Thomas and Nathaniel and the sons of Zebedee, by the way, notice one of them is James, one of them is John. So he's there in any case. And two other of his disciples were together. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. And the others decide to tag along. And they were out all night fishing on the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. And in the morning, they see somebody on the shore. Of course, it's early morning and they're sort of far away. But they look and he calls out to them, cast your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find a catch. And they do it for whatever reason. And suddenly the net is full. Now, I tend to think this was deja vu because Luke describes something similar, although in Luke's account, it's early in the ministry of Jesus. This sounds like it's at the end of the ministry of Jesus. So I think, I could be wrong, but I think it's two different events. And it might have been a little bit of deja vu. But in any case, Peter realizes it's Jesus. And he doesn't wait for the boat. He actually jumps into the water and he swims to shore. And he gets to Jesus. And when Jesus is there, he helps pull in the fish. Chapter 21 and verse 9. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire. Now, there's only two times in the entire Bible where we see reference to a charcoal fire, where this particular Greek term is used. The one time earlier in the Gospel of John is when Peter was warming himself by the charcoal fire, the same place where he denied Jesus. And here you have a second charcoal fire. So it's sort of taking you back to that earlier instance. And when they have eaten, now Jesus questions Peter. And he says to Peter, do you love me? And Peter responds, yes, I love you. And Jesus asks again, do you love me? And Peter again replies, I love you. And he asks a third time, do you love me? Now, scholars have noticed that there's a couple of different words that are used there for love, but also there's a couple of different words that are used for sheep, because each time Jesus says, feed my sheep or tend my lambs. So two different words for feed or tend, two different words for either sheep or lambs, and that might be more of a stylistic thing. You know, I said that John has it, sometimes he'll say the same thing, but he'll use slightly different words. So that might be happening here. But the significant thing, what we're told is significant, Peter becomes a bit upset because Jesus has asked him a third time. And Peter can count. And he knows how many times he denied Jesus. And now he's being asked 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Shepherd my sheep. Tend my sheep. Take care of my lambs. And And Jesus goes on to give a short prophecy about what it will mean for Peter to do that work of taking care of his sheep. It will mean eventually Peter's death. And then Peter hears that and he says, well, what about this fellow over here? This is the last reference to where Peter, this is chapter 21, verse 20, Peter turned around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, and said, well, what about him? And Jesus says, if I want him to remain until I come, don't be dissuaded by that. You follow me. And it's on that note that we read, this is the disciple who's testifying you about these things. And by the way, he didn't say that he wouldn't die. He just said, if I want him to remain until I come, that's not the issue. You follow me. And he closes with this note. This is chapter 21, verse 25. He says, there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. In other words, we have 4 Gospels, but in 4 Gospels, we have not exhausted everything that Jesus did and said. There's a great deal more that could be added, but these are given so that you might believe. Do you love him? Have you come to the point of believing him and then loving him? Then act accordingly.